All right, well, presumably that was 5 seconds. Thank you very much for being on time. You are attending the second meeting of the Community Advisory Panel for the grade separation effort here in Palo Alto. And as is our custom, we are going to make introductions around the table, starting with the panel, and then we'll go into the audience and have those audience members that wish to introduce themselves and identify which neighborhood they're from, and also the staff that are supporting us here today. So my name is Eileen Goodwin. My role is meeting facilitator, and also I take the meeting summary notes, so you'll see me writing things down, and hopefully everybody got a chance to read the notes from last meeting and that they were satisfactory. I'm going to have Rob introduce himself next. We'll go right around the table, and then I'll start in the audience, and we'll do introduction.
Great, thanks Eileen. Rob DeGose. I'm one of 2 deputy city managers, City of Palo Alto. Good to see you all again. I'm going to hand out a little roster just to go around. I did ask everyone if they'd be willing to have their email or their contact information on the roster that we want to submit on the website. If you could indicate, I didn't hear from everybody on that, so if you could indicate yes or no on that, whether it's an email or a phone number, and then jot it down on here, that would be really helpful. I'll pass it this way. Thank you.
And Phil, if you would turn your mic on when you introduce yourself, because remember, we're being taped.
Now that I finished. My name is Phil Burton, B-U-R-T-O-N. I live on Cowper Street, just north of Meadow, meaning just north of Mitchell Park. Officially, I'm representing St. Clair Gardens, but I view my mandate much broader than that. Thank you.
Tony Carrasco. I'm an architect and have been involved with this project for almost 10 years.
Ed Shikata, Assistant City Manager. I will unfortunately need to excuse myself in advance. The City Council meeting starts at 5, and there's a closed session next door, so I'll be leaving then, but monitoring nonetheless.
Hi, I'm Nadia Nayak, and I live in the Old Palo Alto neighborhood, and also I'm a co-founder of CARD, Californians Advocating Responsible Real Design, and like Tony, I've been doing this for about 9 years.
I'm Mandar Borkar. We live off Meadow Drive, West Meadow Drive, trying to represent all the community out there.
Hey there, I'm Greg Braille, live on Edgewood Drive, doing work with Duvernay, St. Francis, and Crescent Park.
Hi, I'm Megan Kahn. I live next to Addison Elementary in University South, and I myself am a renter and a Caltrain rider.
Hi, I'm Carrie Hodson. I live on Star King in the Fairmeadow neighborhood.
Chris Logan. I live on Charleston, have first grade view of the Charleston intersection at Alma. I live in the Walnut Grove community. I'm representing, I guess, the YMCA, the League of Women Voters, and Grace Lutheran Churches are the key community organizations I'm affiliated with.
Great, thanks.
My name is Pat Lau. I was a former consultant with Project Safety Net. My background is in public health and public administration with an emphasis on means restriction and injury prevention. And I live on Altair Walk, which is next to the JCC in South Palo Alto.
Yeah, my name is Parag Patkar. I live in South Palo Alto. The train runs in my backyard, literally, and my house is in between the 2 intersections on Charleston and Meadow. So I obviously represent that community, and we also have a petition going with 500 odd signatories now. We want certain things done, and hence I'm here.
My name is Etty Mercurio. I'm with AECOM. We're the consultants hired by Palo Alto to conduct the studies for these grade separations.
Okay, Peter.
Buddha Jariwala with TJKM. I'm helping the team on traffic.
Nayan Amin with TJKM, supporting the team on traffic.
John Mayer, AECOM, Rail Engineering.
Millette Litzinger with AECOM.
I'm Ken Kirshner, CEO of Trio Motors, a First Mile Solutions company.
Great. Welcome.
Nelson Buchanan, resident of downtown North.
Cedric de la Bourgeois, a resident of Barron Park.
Gary Lindgren, Lincoln and Webster.
Paul Penninger, I'm an economist with AECOM.
Nelson Ng, North Old Palo Alto by Emerson and Melville.
Thank you.
Yoriko Kishimoto, former mayor of Palo Alto. I live in Professorville in Embarcadero, and I was co-founder of Friends of Caltrain and other organizations. Kimberly Wong, Nelson's wife.
Great. Well, welcome and thank you for doing that briefly. Now I'd like to ask Etty to put the agenda up. And as you can see, we've got quite a few items to cover today in our next hour and 50 some odd minutes. We have done the welcome and introductions. In just a minute, I'm going to hand it over to Rob to do a brief update on the Caltrain electrification. I know there was a meeting after our community meeting. He attended, as did several of the CAP members. So we'll get an update on that. And then item number 3 is community conversations. And Rob is going to also kick that off. But also I know that a couple of you have already mentioned to me that you might have some notes to share with the rest of the group on conversations you've been having out with your neighbors and other parts of the community. So we're looking forward to hearing what the community conversation is, and we'll keep that as a regular item on the agenda. Then very briefly, because we've got a lot of meat to cover today, I would like to do the debrief of the community meeting. I'll take that, and I'll be giving you the final survey results of our survey that was both online that evening as well as handed in, so you'll get some new information there. We'll also take a very brief debrief of the outreach materials and the website, and then we'll have a discussion that unfortunately David Shen, who is not able to be here today, this is his item, talk about possibly using a citywide mailing to notify the community about the upcoming meetings still to come. And then we'll move on to talk, as you heard, we've got a couple of people here from TJKM, that's our traffic subconsultant to the AECOM team, and we're going to have Nyan run through the scope and ask you all, we've got quite a bit of time budgeted for this, we're going to ask you all to weigh in on that information that he's shared, whether you think it'll meet the needs of your communities, answer the kinds of questions that you might have. So we'll spend some time on that. Then I'll throw it back over to Etty, who will go through the alternatives update. There's been some refinements since you've last heard from us, so we'll do that. And then as you heard, Paul's here from, he's our team economist, and we've got a few slides. Really, that one is a little bit shorter topic. It's more to wet your whistle and hear back from you so that we can further agendize the finance conversation and sort of maybe meet you where you think we need to be going with that conversation. So today is more a brief touch and then a lot of listening about what you think would be helpful, and then we'll pull some package together for future CAP meetings. And then I'll do what I did before, which is summarize any action items, and we'll adjourn at 6 o'clock. So does anybody have any questions or comments about the agenda before we go right into Caltrain? Okay, seeing none, Rob, you're on.
Okay. Hi, everyone. How you doing? Since last time we met, this is not an electrification, but you may have heard that we no longer have our chief transportation official, Josh Mello. Yeah, it's kind of a big deal for all of us. He was with us for 3 years, and we, wish him all the best. And he's got another opportunity. But he left within sort of 2 weeks. So we're sort of scrambling to to fill the gap without him. And I'm playing a lot of that role with Ed and other members of the city. But did want to be sure you knew that, since he's not here, and you might have a question.
Which also means please stop emailing him. You'll have to send those to Rob now.
Yeah, exactly. But this item of Caltrain electrification, really an important one. There was a community meeting at the Lucy Stone Community Center on August 28th, and it was in a room that was far too small. I don't know how many people went to that meeting. I saw a few of you there. Thank you for attending and being there. But we thought it was important to put it on the agenda just so that that you become aware of what's happening with Caltrain and electrification, because that's the reason largely why we're doing grade separation in the first place. And it's a really important project. Caltrain's moving from running diesel trains to electric trains, and that allows for a number of different things. One, it's a lot more environmentally friendly, but it allows them to run a lot more service up and down the peninsula. And with traffic being one of the biggest issues we face as a community and as a peninsula, really, having increased level of service along the Caltrain corridor is especially important. So as CAP members, as you go out and you talk to your neighbors and you talk to different groups about grade separation, having some some grounding in what Caltrain is doing and why they're moving to electrification and what that means in terms of service is really important. And Caltrain, to their credit, have put together some really easy to understand FAQs. I brought them with me today, so you can all take them with you. So there's two. There's a sort of a status update, and it shows a timeline of what they're doing and when we'll start to see some changes along the corridor. And then there's the FAQs, which is 4 pages. So I would just encourage you all to take the opportunity to get up to speed on what's happening with Caltrain and electrification, because it is a big part of the story of grade separation.
This is Cap.
And they'll have more meetings along the way. I think actually there's one happening this evening in Sunnyvale on similar to what happened, type of community meeting we had here at the Lucy Stone Community Center. But to the extent that we can provide additional information if you need it, if you're going out to speak, do let us know. But these 2 documents certainly I think will help a lot. Those of you that were at the meeting, did you have anything that you wanted to share with the group or questions?
Rob, I was just going to say, the Caltrain has another graphic that's similar to the regional ones, but just talks about Caltrain overall, where it explains that they're the equivalent of 2 lanes of traffic in each direction during rush hour. It has more specifics about how we're the 3rd most congested corridor in the United States. We're 14% of California's GDP, 20%. I mean, there's like a whole host of other statistics, which in addition to electrification, you know, the greenhouse gas emission savings from electrification, I think is really important when we talk about the role of transit, because a lot of times we get from community members the question of, well, why do I care about Caltrain? And I think that helps answer a big part of the question, and it makes the point that it's regionally significant. So to the extent that we could add that graphic somewhere, that would be helpful.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just add that sounds like a very, very conservative estimate, 2 lanes of traffic. It all depends on what you define as.
It's based on the Spur study, so it was done by independent analysts.
Okay, that sounds like level of service E.
How many more trains will they be able to run per hour? Is it true that they'll be able to run 5 per hour now rather than 4 per hour? Or am I incorrect?
That's in our PowerPoint. Do
We
you
actually,
recall?
go ahead, Eddie.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, they currently run 10 trains an hour. When Caltrain electrifies, their plan is to run 12 trains an hour, but they have the possibility of running more, and they haven't determined how many until the Caltrain business plan is completed. But it's up to about 20 is what the city has presented previously.
Thank you.
Okay, do you want to go ahead and take the next item, the community conversations, and people can just add in if they have other thoughts on Caltrain as they do their debriefs?
Yeah, and this is, thank you, Eileen. This is more, you know, a sort of a broad topic of discussion as well. You know, one of the most important things that you do as CAP members is to help us connect with your neighbors and the community generally about this project, about where we are in the process, about why we're moving forward with certain alternatives and not moving forward with other alternatives. You know, it's just a really important and critical role that you play there. What we want to do is be sure that we're providing you support to have those conversations, or in some cases, you know, presentations to groups. And so we wanted to put it on the agenda to be, first of all, to see if you had questions about that, or do you have information that you need that would help you do those presentations more, you know, effectively or more easily. They're very important that you do that. We want to hear from, of course, all of you as 12 members of the CAP, but we really see you as conduits to the rest of the community, as well as staff and the consultants are. So, you know, how can we help you do that most effectively? One of the things that we want to be especially sure about is that the communication that is going out that is consistent, you know, among the CAP members and among the team. And it can easily not be consistent if we're not careful. And, you know, it's not necessarily intentional, but if each individual member is sort of creating their own presentation and presenting, it can create confusion in the public. And we want to be especially careful not to do that, because there's a lot at stake. There's a lot of money at stake. There's, you know, potential property at stake. And so we want to be very thoughtful and careful and intentional about what we put out in communication, even what you say to your neighbors and as you have those conversations. So we're committed on our side to be sure to give you information like you have with Caltrain electrification, FAQs, those types of things, so you can do those presentations easily, succinctly, and in different formats. So if you're doing a presentation to the Rotary Club or something, that you have a presentation you can pull on and say, yeah, okay, I'm going to use that. Or if it's just a simple FAQ that you want to give to a neighbor, that you have that. And to the extent that you have questions or ideas about how we can provide that kind of information or in what format, let us know, because we'll be sure that we'll create those and get them to you. Any questions about that? Does that make sense?
All right, let's also take a little bit of time on this agenda item to just debrief if there's some rumors out in the world that we ought to be aware of. I'm going to ask our member who just joined us to introduce herself. Could you introduce yourself? Press the button.
Hi, this is In Young Cho. I live in Southgate. So.
Thank you. Thank you. So right now, I know, Greg, you had some conversations with some neighbors in some of your community. If there's a couple other people who want to just share what thoughts people had. The next item is going right into a debrief of the community meeting. So I think we could blend these two items together. So feel free to take a moment and just jump in and give us some feedback. Greg, I'm going to put you on the spot because I know you had some notes.
Sure, yeah. I mean, a few of the, just observing what people who had questions for me and others at the community meeting and a few people online, there especially seems to be a lot of confusion around Churchill. And I think one of the things that I think even at the community meeting we didn't do a great job of addressing was what decisions have already been made and who made them and why. So the fact that the only option for Churchill that I've seen is closing it seems to really surprise people, and they get really, and online there were some folks who were getting really exercised in Palo Alto online, where I'm very, very careful because everything there is anonymous, but there were a few people who were really going on about that. One area I also noticed from the community meeting was there was a little bit of hand-waving about building a trench across the two creeks we have in that part of town, Matadero and I think Adobe, right? Sort of a little bit of, yeah, I don't know what we're going to do. There's a creek and there's a trench, and they seem to occupy the same three-dimensional space. That's a real big issue in town. In my neighborhood, San Francisco Creek is extremely important because when it floods, it costs lots of money. So that's another issue. And the third thing, and this may be my own personal curiosity that I can take offline, but I don't think the town has enough information about the freight trains. Most people don't realize there are freight trains. How often do they run? Mm-hmm. Are they ever going to go away? I think the answer is probably no. What do they do? What would the impact of a 1% grade versus a 2% grade be on a freight train and the noise that it makes? I'm sure that there will be one. So I think that people who want to dig more into this issue other than, wait, what do you mean they're going to close this intersection? Right. Start to ask questions about things like that, and that's why the solutions don't seem as simple as the sort of why don't we just conversations that I hear. So those are three specific things I had.
Thank you. Those are fantastic.
Could I make a quick comment?
Yeah.
I will be happy to delve into those issues if I can meet with somebody from Caltrain or talk about that. I mean, I have the background that allows me to really understand that issue.
Perhaps we should get a briefing from Caltrain or Union Pacific.
Yeah, sure, and I would give them a whole list of questions I'd like answered.
I'd like to echo some of the things that Greg said. I've been hearing concern about the Churchill closure, as well as I think a lack of understanding whether the status quo is still one of the alternatives. It's not on the that spreadsheet, and so folks don't know, is leaving these things open and doing nothing still an option? So I think that pointing that out or clarifying whether it's still an option would help people understand better. And also, I'm really excited to hear an update about the traffic study, because lots of folks had feedback about that.
Great. Anybody else on kind of what they're hearing? Yeah, Pat.
I had a discussion during the meeting or after the meeting with Dr. Shashank Joshi, who is on the work group for, it's suicide prevention means restriction. And there's a group that meets occasionally to discuss issues related to train safety, as well as other prevention-related issues for suicide. And he had a question as to whether the group feels that suicide is a critical issue. on the rails. And I had to ask a few people during the meeting or after the meeting whether they thought that was a concern, and these were community members. And most of them seemed to think that injuries do occur, intentional as well as unintentional, and that it's almost a part of being near a railroad, that there are going to be injuries and that it's something that one has to accept. And there was actually a gentleman who said over the 20 years that he's lived in Palo Alto, it's always been that way. So I had to question that in terms of my public health background and whether or not that is something that is, again, is this a fact of life or is this something that we need to address? And of course, Dr. Joshi and I agreed that it was something we need to address.
Great, thank you. Phil, and then Mander?
Yeah, so both in talking to people during and after the community meeting and just some various online and other conversations, what I'm picking up is a lot of, well, not confusion as much as lack of satisfactory information on how much is this really going to cost. And the other comment is, what is this going to look like? So I would like to suggest that if there is resource for it, that we create three-dimensional videos.
We will
or
be doing that.
three-dimensional models.
That is part of the scope.
I'd like to say the sooner the better.
It will be there at the next meeting.
Okay, that would be.
Not the CAP meeting, but
that'd
at
be
the
very
community
helpful.
meeting.
Okay, so those are my comments.
Great, okay, Mander, and then we'll go back to Rob.
We saw that a lot of the community members asked questions about how to get questions to this forum. And so we created a little website where we captured about 20 odd questions. I had already sent that out to Rob and I don't know who, one other Eileen. And so the question really from our end is, how do we get that back to us, the answers to those questions back to us? Is that through FAQs? How do we get that back to the community? Because I don't want to spend going through all these 20 questions in these 2 hours.
Yeah, we can't do it today. No, I agree with you, it's offline.
What's our process to get that back is the real question here.
Okay, Rob?
Yeah, just on that one first, I think the FAQ process is the best way to do it, is to have an update the FAQs regularly, and then there'll be additional questions that individuals will have, and then she'll help us answer directly with people. I think that's helpful. And to Phil, your question, and I just want to be sure, and I want to respond to that directly, so I want to be sure we're all on the same page, is that we're in a process of trying to narrow the alternatives so that we can actually do a much deeper dive and spend the money on circulation studies and costs and aesthetics and all of those things. And so I can appreciate the people who are saying we don't have enough information right now. Well, that's because we haven't narrowed the field down enough to be able to really say we're going to focus on these, 5, 6 alternatives. We can't do that kind of analysis on 34 alternatives.
Yeah.
So that's where we are.
I'd like to say that when people said, why don't we just tunnel the whole thing, I would say, well, you want to spend $2 to $4 billion. And I would say that's a very rough number. And they would go, wow.
Yeah, so we'll be talking about that. Go ahead.
So I understand you'll update the FAQs. Would you let us know that we have looked at all the questions and we have addressed it, some mechanism to tell us, because they have spent the time thinking through all this. So just to be respectful to them, getting that back. If you can tell us we looked through all of them, this set, we're done, here are the answers through the FAQs or through other mechanics, that will be very helpful. Especially if they're all spending this time and investing it in getting these questions out there, it's fair to expect a response back.
Yeah, so thanks, Manda. We can do that certainly, and we'll also take a look at how we might be able to build that into our own website so that we don't have you all doing your own individual setting up of questions and trying to respond. So there's some limit to capacity for us to be able to respond if we're getting 1,000 questions, a week or something, but
so Phil said, if there is any way for us to help in that manner, we can help.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to move us on because of time. Nadia?
Just one more quick. So I had already given this feedback, but just to make sure the rest of the group knows, the graphic that you guys have that has a chart that shows the different intersections that are being considered, when the council voted both for Churchill and for Palo Alto Avenue, they included the words "and other road improvements." And in the case of Palo Alto Avenue, that may mean doing something to University. And in the case of Churchill, that may mean doing something to Embarcadero or surrounding streets. And that was a source of great confusion among the group, is understanding if I live near University or I live near Embarcadero, which table was I supposed to go to and what's going on. And I think the graphic as presented, even though those intersections are already separated, it would be helpful to explain that there may or may not be impacts based on the different alternatives that are being considered. And also explaining better, exactly as I said, why Churchill has been eliminated, but also why we're not talking about some of the existing grade separations and how that may or may not change.
Great. Thank you. Good feedback. Yes? Tony?
My outreach was also similar to some of the issues that you brought up about Churchill, about why it was eliminated, and that someone said that no one group should impose a cost on some other group as a result of the solution. For instance, if you close Churchill, Embarcadero is going to get impacted, and that you cannot look at those two separately. That was one issue. The other issue was several people talked about not being conservative or realistic, my word, about budget, that we should be aspirational and look at other sources of revenue other than the 300 million that we get. And my last issue is the comprehensive plan and what it talks about related to downtown. The issue is better connection, pedestrian and bikes and cars through that area that right now encompasses the train station, that it should be better connected to downtown.
Well, and that's a very good point. And both you and Nadia brought that up offline, and because we were so packed today, but we do have it in our work plan that Rob and I are working on, and we're going to have land use and connectivity and things like that coming forward for the group to have that, because that was a very thoughtful thought from both of you. I am going to move us on just to keep us on time. The next item, I wanted to share with you all what the final results were of the meeting survey, both online through people doing it on their phones as well as the ones that were handed in. So we hit a home run with the venue and location, and unlike the Caltrain, our room was just right, I thought. They thought the food was good. People had 100%. They liked that. I was very happy to see that there was 90% support for the meeting format, because we changed up what your traditional format has been on this outreach in the past with the other consultant team, and this was a big home run again. 90% support is very, very positive. The graphics, I think, were obviously at 2/3 support, pretty good. There's some opportunities to do better, as Phil mentioned, and we do have in the budget to do a lot more visioning and a lot more three-dimensional aspects to it, but as Rob mentioned, we need to get it down to a manageable number in order to be able to do that, but that is intended for both the November and January meetings to have those types of graphics. So I hope to see this score go up. But I did hear at the meeting, several people mentioned that Etty's graphics of sort of building how the project would happen were very helpful, more than static graphics. So we got some very good feedback there. We also found out that people realized and self-articulated they knew where to go for more information, which is the website, which was great. Where we fell down, but we knew this was going to happen, was were there questions answered. And again, I think this comes up to both what Tony and Phil were talking about. There was a great hunger in your community to talk about money. And we do not have that. We will have that for November, but we did not have that. That was one reason why in the beginning of the meeting, we made it very clear we're not talking about how to build it tonight, nor were we talking about money. And there were a lot of people who came to the meeting energized to talk about those two topics. So I think that's why our score was low. And when we dug into some of that, and then people did know when to find the next meeting, although shockingly, since we talked about it so many times, it wasn't 100%. But hopefully people, I think I said right after Thanksgiving about 1 million times when I was up front, but at least it was better than half of the people knew where to to find information and also when the next meeting would be. So any other thoughts before we move on? Because I would like to get your feedback on the outreach materials and the website for those of you who have been out there, so that if there's any tweaks, we've got Millette here. Yeah,
Yeah,
Parag.
so on number 5, so consistent feedback I got from a lot of folks is those tables were a great idea. And folks like Etty and John, I mean, you guys know your stuff, so you had the right people manning those booths, which was great. But they were not open for long enough for everybody's questions to be answered.
Okay, so longer time in the stations.
Right, and so people were very frustrated, right? So if we can take some load off of you, right, we can man the booths. I mean, we did, me and my
great.
brother did that yesterday.
Great.
Right?
Okay.
At a community meeting. But essentially, the idea is everyone's questions need to be answered, right? Every last person's. It needs to be like a, private sector trade show. Every last question needs to be answered.
Great. No, that's great feedback. Anybody else on the community meeting? All right, let's talk about the website. Yeah, Mender, or either way.
So quick thing to add to Parag's, that material, those boards and such, we had a Ventura neighborhood meeting yesterday, and we were hunting around for those boards as such. And so Parag and his kid put together their own experimental boards. And so if those material are available for us when we present in our different meetings, that would be extremely helpful.
And they are online. They're posted online.
Not the board, right?
Like we need the
Yeah,
big-
no, the board graphics are online.
Yeah, no, the graphics are, but if you could just keep it in a warehouse somewhere else and we
Well,
could
that would be something Rob would have to take a note. Maybe there's some checkout system the city could come up with, because the AECom offices are not anywhere close to Palo Alto, so I'm sure you don't want to go to Walnut Creek or downtown San Jose. So that would be something we'll have the
Eileen,
city look into.
I would like
checkouts.
to add that at the last community meeting, I found myself several times explaining to people how to read those boards. They're fine for the engineers who created them, but they're not so good for the average person who has no idea what a station is, meaning 100 feet, or what's an elevation or plan. They just want a pretty picture. That's the point of the
And we'll be getting them those.
Yes. Okay.
Also, a shoe fly. A shoe
Yeah.
fly is a temporary track. I actually had to think about that for like half an hour.
I know, it's not a
All right,
pie
okay.
all this
Right,
time.
it's a temporary, just call it a temporary track. Yeah.
Hey, also, Rob, not to make it very complicated, I can just keep it in my garage. I'm always on my phone, so whoever wants it can just pick it up and just.
So maybe there's another set we could make for the CAP members, and they could swap it around on the weekends when you're not here. I think that would be a good thing. Okay, that's great. All right, and then the one last item before we get into the traffic scope, as I mentioned in the introduction, David had mentioned at the last meeting, he would like to see a mailing citywide. And in my mind, this, if we decide this is a good idea, the time would be, I think, in the next bit for us to create some sort of flyer/meeting announcement for both the November and the January meetings, because we know when they're going to be and we know where they're going to be and what time, et cetera. And so if we did a citywide mailing, we could turn it into almost like the fact sheet about the project, what we're trying to do, announce the website, and then announce the 2 meetings. Does that seem reasonable to you all? Would you recommend that, or is that not time well and money well spent?
I would agree. That's a very good suggestion. When I talk to my neighbors, they don't seem to know very much about the issue. It's very strange because, again, even the terminology, grade separation, and I have to explain it, and yet, and I would think, and again, people are very busy, but those of us who read the news on a daily basis, and we have the time and we're well informed, but a lot of my neighbors do not have that time. And I feel like I have to inform them and provide that information, so it's nice to hear that other people are having community meetings. And I went to one that Nadia had the other day. And so it's very helpful when we have the information, the tools, and perhaps talking points or whatever, you want to provide for us, so that it is a consistent message.
Good.
I think there's clarification.
You need to put your thing on, Chris, if you would. And also, Nyan, if you would come and join us at the table, we'll go right into the next item.
I think clarification in the written material, if you can, so that, I get mailings about Charleston corridor projects being done, Caltrain being done, and grade separation, and I think clarification of what's what and who's doing it would be immensely helpful, especially for people that are, I got 2 mailings about the Caltrain
Right.
meeting, so that was good. And I think if we can clarify who's doing what would be real helpful.
Good suggestion.
If I
All
could,
right, Carrie or Nadia?
oh, go ahead.
Anybody? Okay, Nadia, you're on.
I was going to recommend a super low budget way to get more people. So, I mean, we could do this outreach process perfectly, but if we're not reaching the right cross section of the community, it's going to be tough. And so, could we think about potentially partnering with the school district and the PTA, not to necessarily talk about what alternatives are, but literally just like a basic, it could be a kid's video that's explaining what is a grade separation? What does that mean? Right? Something really basic to just get the issue on the parents' radars, because I think I've done a lot of community meetings. I tend to get a much older crowd. It's really hard to get parents, and it's really hard to get parents of kids. And, you know, they are the people that will be here in the next 50 years. They're a lot of our safety concerns when we talk about bike and pedestrian things, and I just feel like they're really missing in the conversation.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, last comment, Megan.
Sorry, we should use our school city traffic safety commission is what Penny is suggesting.
Good. Okay, we'll take it as under advisement and talk to the city team and see how we can accommodate something like that. Okay, Megan, and then we're moving on to traffic.
Very quickly, agreeing with Pat that it's really hard when you're using terms like shoe fly or even grade separation. The fact the website is called PA Grade Sep. I mean, it's an abbreviation of a term that people don't understand. So maybe it's too late now to change the way that we're doing this marketing, but road crossings, rail crossings, temporary tracks, the more that we can avoid the technical terms, I think the better.
Okay, great. All right, Nayan, you're on, and we need to have him have a mic.
Thanks, Eileen, and good evening, everyone. So the primary scope, the primary objective of the traffic study is to evaluate the impacts of permanent closure of the streets on the transportation infrastructure within City of Palo Alto, and eventually help the team to come to an alternatives that can be carried forward into the next phase of the project. Next slide. As it applies for this type of evaluation, we laid out a preliminary traffic scope, is basically collecting the existing data. There was a lot of data that was collected back in February of 2017, which we're gonna go talk about it in detail in the next couple of slides. And then once we collect all the existing data, we would be evaluating the existing conditions, projecting the future traffic demands, and then evaluating the existing and future conditions with and without the project, which would include the closure and the other improvements that might happen. And then in order to evaluate the impact of traffic diverting onto some of the residential street, we will be conducting a tire analysis wherever we have the closures proposed, and eventually developing the recommendations that needs to offset some of the impacts that might be caused because of some of the roadway closures.
Sorry, you might want to define tire analysis.
I'm sorry?
What does tire mean?
Tire is a traffic infusion residential evaluation? Yes. Residential street.
For the non-traffic people, that is the little rubber hoses you drive over that count how many cars there are.
I have a
So how we gonna be?
question on scope. What about analysis during construction of the alternatives that impact the roadways?
So the scope, what I have it right now over here, is to reduce the number of alternatives that needs to be carried forward. But eventually, the impacts during construction would also be evaluated based on the staging plans developed later on. Okay. How we are going to be evaluating the existing conditions, we would be using the existing data and the new data what we will collect. Synchro is one of the software that's been used to evaluate the level of service, which gives you average delay along at the study intersections and the roadway segments, including the queues. So we would be using that software, which is most widely used in City of Palo Alto as well as in Santa Clara County. And the existing conditions evaluation would be done to develop a baseline, so that way when we are measuring the impacts, we are measuring the impacts to the baseline conditions. Yes?
What is the frequency of the data being collected? Is it like 24/7 or is this like a period of time?
So if we are collecting the data on the roadway segments, usually we collect 24-hour data for 7 days a week. And if we are doing a study, any intersection evaluation, we usually collect for the AM and PM peak periods, which is basically 2-hour peak period, 7 to 9 in the morning, 4 to 6 in the evening.
Okay,
Conditions
Penny?
might be different. If we get an input or feedback that instead of 4 to 6, we need to do 4:30 to 6:30, we are open for that.
You might want to repeat the question to the mic.
Penny?
Will school community safety impact, that would be safety impacts on bicyclists and pedestrians be studied?
Yes.
And how will that be studied?
So we
So
would
can
be.
you answer, you can repeat the question so it ends up on the
So
tape?
the question is that, are there going to be the pedestrian and bicycle safety issues gonna be, safety issue as well as circulation part is gonna be studied, and how we gonna be doing that? So as a part of the analysis, we would be conducting a collision analysis for all modes of transportation, which would include automobile, pedestrian, bike, and then also look at the connectivity for the pedestrian and bicycle as well as the transit users. And based on that, the evaluation would be conducted to identify the deficiencies within the network, and recommendations would be developed to enhance that safety
Okay.
and circulation.
How many more slides do you have? Because we're starting to get hands up.
I think if I can quickly go through it, and then I would be, I can open it up for Q&A, that might be easier. So the next step would be, we would be evaluating, in order to evaluate the future conditions and estimate the diversion in traffic due to some of the proposed closures, we would utilize the Santa Clara Valley Authority travel demand model for future projections based on the input what I got from the last community meeting and what we are aware of some of the issues with the travel demand model. The first step, we would be enhancing the VTA travel demand model, looking at some of the turn restrictions, street classification, as well as trying to calibrate or replicate the model within the FAA guidelines to the data what we would be collecting out in the field. Next slide.
Question. Was the TDM data not sufficient or detailed enough that required you to collect your own data?
I think it would be better for me to talk about it when I roll out this map. So that might answer your question.
Thank you.
Once we do the future year projections, we would be conducting or evaluating the future conditions at the study intersections and roadway segments. Next slide, Atipo. As I mentioned earlier, that there was some data on the 24-hour basis as well as during the peak hour collected as a part of the earlier study back in February 2017. Next slide. And some of the things were, what we understand that the three main alternatives we need to evaluate for us to narrow down the alternatives to be considered and move forward in the, into the future phases of the project is we need to evaluate the closure for Palo Alto, Churchill, and combine Palo Alto and Churchill closure. With that, I would like to roll this map out. So
And
that
Nayan, if you would also explain why you don't need to do the other intersections that some of these people live near?
I think I have it
Okay.
over here.
Just make sure you cover it. And please feel free to stand up and move behind so you can see this. It looks like it's oriented that way, so maybe behind Carrie and Megan and Chris will be easier to read, so all the street names are towards you versus upside down.
So what we have on this map,
So north, first let's start.
the north is facing that way.
North is to.
And which creek is this one? There you go. And then this one? There you go. Oregon Expressway.
Oregon Expressway, over here we have Palo Alto, University, Embarcadero, Oregon, and Charleston. The one in triangle is where we have turning movement counts at the study intersections, which was collected back in February of 2017. If you count those triangles, it's only about 12 to 13 intersections.
So that's where the tire analysis will come.
No.
Sorry, I didn't get it.
So study intersections is basically level of service or average delay, what you're going to get at a signalized or a non-signalized intersection. The tire analysis is basically conducted along the roadway segments. Okay? So that's what the triangle represents. The one you see, the green dots, what we are proposing based on our knowledge of the area and what we heard from the community meeting, that if we close Palo Alto, the one where you see the dots are the ones where you need to do a level of service analysis.
Explain that.
And we also need to do the tire analysis within the area bounded by it.
So what does level of service analysis entail, and what do you get at the other end?
So it basically tells you when you approach an intersection, how many seconds you are going to be delayed, or you would have to stop. How long the queue lanes are going to be. Are you going to be stuck behind a 1 mile long queue, or are you going to be stuck behind a 100 feet long queue?
I see. So seconds and
That's correct. So it basically the level of service is represented in an average delay per vehicle arriving at an intersection.
How do you measure? Like counter? You track the car, vehicle?
So we would be yes, we count the number of cars, and then we also take the green time or the signal timing, what might be out there in the field, and based on that the calculations are done.
So this is readers on the roadway to pick up those readings, right?
That's correct.
Is there a way nowadays with all these GPS and cell phone, will we be able to get some data from Google or Waze?
Well, you can get it, that type of data, but the only thing what you're going to come to know is that between Middlefield, on University, between Middlefield,
Off your shirt. No, you can leave it on, but you can take it off your shirt.
at the most what it's going to give you might be able to do is that if you are traveling on University in the southbound direction from Middlefield to Alma, it's going to take you 20 minutes. That's all I can do it with the GPS data, what Google might give it to me. It would not give me the average delay at an intersection because, and we can take that route if everyone agrees to it. The problem, what we need to understand, that the minute we close Palo Alto, there might be folks who might come back and say that by closing this, you are impacting this intersection, and now my delay is going to be so much. So we need to be prepared for that.
Are you also, as part of level of service, going to talk about roadway speeds?
No.
Okay.
So in terms of the dots that you have for Churchill, so the biggest thing that happens at Churchill that we notice in the data is Churchill is actually used for turning movements on and off of Alma. So for example, I live in this neighborhood. When I'm coming home, there's usually a delay at the light at Churchill, so most people actually turn on Melville and Kellogg, which means those need to be included in your study. The other thing that also needs to be included is depending on the timing of the light, people who live here will wait out that light and then cut through the neighborhood here. So in fact, all of these intersections here will count off how many people are peeling off through the neighborhood, particularly along Seal, because it's the one road that actually cuts all the way through to Middlefield and further back.
So Nadia, that's a really good suggestion, and that's why we wanted to
So
bring this over here so that we can get your feedback and determine that which are the intersections we need to include in the study.
So Seal, particularly because it's one that crosses all the way down the city. It goes all the way down to Newell. It's
Okay.
one of the few cut-through streets.
So I have kind of a basic question, which is, I went back and looked at the original motion, and it calls for a study of the partial closure of Churchill. So what scenarios of partial closing are you including?
I think partial closing related to pedestrian and bikes being able to go through, but not cars.
No, that's not true. It says break out Churchill Avenue into full closure and partial closure.
Yeah, it was peak hour.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, it was
I
peak
think,
hour.
so Caltrain should need to answer that because I believe they.
I know, but we need to think about.
For sure,
If
yeah.
it's just peak hour, they would close it, or, right, that kind of thing.
So if it's only a closure during the peak hour, it's basically a full closure for traffic analysis, because that's what we are trying to analyze the worst conditions.
You're looking
Right.
only at peak hour?
That's correct.
more like a peak period. It could be 1 hour or 2 hours.
I would also recommend that you check out your calendar versus the Palo Alto Unified School District days that they're off, because the last traffic study was off because they did it on a day that the district was closed. And so it didn't measure all the turns that were happening here
No,
correctly.
we would make sure that the day when we send out the crew to get the traffic data collected, the
also-
schools are in session.
The other difference is Stanford and Castilleja, so they all run on different schedules, right?
Yep.
We'll check all those.
Yes, ma'am.
Also, I'm sorry. So also there was, so in your tire analysis, I'm assuming you can make out the difference between a bicycle tire and a car tire.
No, that is a
No.
different tire.
No?
No.
Then how do you know school kids, because for example, one road is
so-
just taken over by school kids for half an hour in the morning.
So this is how the tire analysis has been done. You collect your 24-hour data, right? And let's say we collected traffic, 24-hour data for 7 days on Palo Alto Avenue.
Yeah.
We utilize the travel demand model, take out the connection over the railroad on Palo Alto.
Okay.
And then rerun the model without that link there. So based on the remaining network available and based on the gravity, traffic is redistributed. The one which was going to cross the railroad tracks and go to Sand Hill, it's redistributed based on the capacity available, the speed and the signal timing. And that would tell us that 10% of the traffic which was crossing the railroad now is going to use Emerson to get to University and get on the other side of the railroad tracks. 5% is going to go on Waverly or something along that line. So that's what we mean by tire analysis, that 5% more traffic or 5% of the traffic on Palo Alto is going to be now using Waverly to go through around.
But in this case, you've broken out the bicyclists and the vehicles, right? So I'm assuming there's a way for you to, I don't need to know how you do it, but there's a way for you to differentiate between pedestrian traffic.
For the study
bicyclists.
intersections, yes. At an intersection, we would count.
Okay,
as
folks,
bike-
one at a time. This is being taped. Let's be respectful for the people who might try and watch this later. Go ahead, Nayan, you have the floor.
Yes, ma'am.
So I just want to point out that any measurement of level of service impacts regarding closure of Churchill should also include East Meadow and Charleston, because South Palo Alto trips that generate in the southern part of the city that are going, forgive me, I'm sorry, I'm not using the mic. I think that any measurement of level of service impacts related to the Churchill closure should include Charleston and East Meadow crossings, because trips that come from the south, a lot of people who do that, they use Alma because it's a fast route across town, and they presently cut across at Churchill to get to El Camino, to go to points north on El Camino, including Stanford and whatever else there is down there.
We have already proposed a couple of intersections along Meadow and Charleston as a part of both closures. Do you think that we should add any more than the ones what are?
Well, if you're studying what potential impacts are, I think it'd be a good idea to just look at.
So we already have. Do you?
See all these dots? Those are the ones they're measuring.
Oh, okay, all right, I couldn't.
So
think
they're
I was
there.
Standing back, okay, very
See,
good.
Meadow?
All right,
Yeah,
very
yeah.
good, then. Thank you.
Good.
So it's just a color difference. What we were trying to say is
Here's the
Palo Alto
legend.
is green, Churchill is blue, and the combination of both on Meadow is red, orange. That was only the color difference.
I would like to.
It doesn't mean anything else. It's just the different closures.
So
Okay.
Sorry.
You get one final, and then there's other people who've been
Your
waiting.
time analysis will measure all the cut-through neighborhood, because like for me, I live on Melville and Emerson, and when the last couple months, when there was major accidents on Elma, I pick up a lot of traffic on our residential street. So will you be able to measure most of the streets in Old Palo Alto from your tire analysis?
So, can you repeat what street you mentioned? Emerson and?
Emerson and Melville.
Melville.
So it's right there. And last couple of months, I noticed that there was like, when there was a lot of traffic on our streets, And then later, I found out in the news that there was major crash or something like that. The traffic was being redirected. So we want to see how your tire analysis will be able to measure what neighborhoods are you going to be measuring.
So the ones what we are illustrating or what are being represented over here, those are the neighborhoods which are going to be evaluated.
Just the dots.
Yes.
The dots and the roadway segment surrounding it.
But not to the right.
But yeah.
So when you look at this one, on Churchill, the segment between Churchill and Embarcadero is going to be included
So
in the
everything
tire
will be-
analysis.
Your neighborhood all.
Okay. Right.
What about?
Okay, let's take turns. This gentleman's been waiting. Vander.
So I can't see there, but do you have Page Mill covered?
Yes.
You're tracking?
Yes.
Is-
No, not Page Mill and Alma.
No, Page Mill and El Camino.
Page Mill and Alma. So
Yes,
the
that's
reason I-
covered.
Yes, yes.
Yep.
Okay, so the reason I asked that is if I can't get Churchill to get onto the high school, I then take, I'm on Meadow. I take Alma, get off on Page Mill, then take El Camino and get through.
No,
So that's our
we
usual.
have check,
You
Page
might
Mill
want to
and-
do this as well, because this is the, like the Waze or the Google Maps
Right, and it's
of
covered.
this year.
It's covered. Oh, you're talking
That's
about that
the Waze and
particular,
Google Maps recommended
going into the
drive,
circles?
Both these are congested.
Does this represent bikes as well, where you would do bike study?
at the intersections.
We'll get the counts.
Okay.
Okay, this lady was patiently waiting. You're on? You, okay. Okay, yes.
Okay, so a comment
Phil?
and a question. To the extent that we're worried about diversion of traffic from Alma, we might want to study Middlefield at a couple of points. Second is,
There are several
All right,
points on
okay.
Middlefield.
Embarcadero and Middlefield, Oregon, Middlefield, Meadow and Middlefield,
all right,
Charleston
and
and
nothing,
Middlefield.
but nothing in between.
Nothing in between.
Okay. Actually, a question is, I think I know the answer, but I want to make sure. Are you modeling the entire traffic grid down to individual streets where necessary? That is, you can forecast, or you can model diversions onto individual streets in a grid in a neighborhood?
So the VTA travel demand model has all of the streets that are within the city of Palo Alto infrastructure, roadway infrastructure. Said that there might be some junctions where it might be allowing some turns which might be prohibited out in the field. So that's why I said that we're gonna go and look at it and try to fix it.
That wasn't my question. My question was, is the model granular enough that you can actually get down to individual streets?
It's a planning level model that would give you at a planning level.
Okay.
And one thing I wanna mention is that in real world, on a daily basis, there is a 10 to 15% variation in traffic.
Of course.
There is not a single location or a single day where you're gonna find the same count on a daily basis. Throughout the year, every day you're gonna get within the 10 to 15% fluctuation. And that's what the travel demand model is, that it gives you within the 10 to 15% of the count what you would collect out in the field. Yes, sir.
Does VTA model include Menlo Park, Ravenswood, and the new bike underpass in Burgess Park?
It includes the existing infrastructure. It does not include the ones which are being programmed, planned, or under construction.
Is there any plan to measure the impact in
No.
Menlo Park?
We are going to be measuring only within the city of Palo Alto limits.
I think that's an oversight, I just want to say, because that's right adjacent to Menlo Park, and that the next junction up is Ravenswood. It's a major traffic crossover, and everything south of that will come and turn at Palo Alto.
Okay, yes.
So are you collecting all the points in concurrently every single, in one day? Or are you taking this one day, that one day? You're segmenting.
We would have to break it down
Right. So,
over a week.
yeah, then you can study relationship between this over there because that might, closing.
That's why we are collecting 24-hour counts for 7 days, to allow us to establish the correlation between the three different
Okay,
locations.
so can you imagine, a lot of people circle again here, but you could, potentially find out what this, what would be here in the congestion because you already have these 2 points, right?
Well, we are, as I said, that we identified the intersection which we think is going to give us enough information to make a good sound decision based on technicality or technical analysis. However, we did not want it to leave the neighborhoods out. And that's why we asked for suggestions. And if the neighborhood is gonna come and tell us that we need to evaluate it, as a group, we would have to go back and look at it. We cannot ignore it.
Okay, Mander, and then we'll come back to this public person.
So I had a comment and a question. So the first comment is thank you for showing this to us before you actually do it, rather telling us about it after. So thanks for that. And second is, could we get this as an email, soft copy or something, and take time next meeting or someplace else later?
I don't think you've got that kind of time.
We don't have that type of time because for the second community meeting.
No, so bottom line is what we're looking for is we want to digest this and maybe go across some more of our community members, get their feedback and bring it back to the table, which might be productive for you guys as well.
I don't think we have the ability to wait till October 10th for these folks to be able to present in November with the holiday in there. So we could probably get you something. I'm looking at Rob and have a deadline in between now and that meeting. That probably would work. Give you like a week or something.
Any mechanics for us to digest it and get it back to you in whatever form we can organize.
Okay, we'll have Rob. It's Monday. Do you think that by maybe next Monday you could get results back to Rob and that would keep us somewhat on schedule?
Yes. Yep.
And we'll take all the input we're already getting today. Nadia, and then we'll come to this public person.
So I just want to.
And then Tony, I'm sorry, I always want to try and get the community working group types before I go to the public, and you've already had plenty of time. So I want to make sure these folks get done. Nadia and then Tony.
So I think getting the feedback before we start the study is great. I just think that, frankly, for people who didn't even know what a tire analysis was or what the VTA model is, this is not the best way for anyone to digest what that means, what the analysis is. And so we have a rail committee meeting coming up. Anybody who's following rail probably didn't know that this was going to be discussed necessarily nested under the citizen advisory panel meeting. And since the agenda is not up yet for the next meeting, then maybe we could use the time during the rail committee meeting to actually go over this, because I think this is the kind of map that people benefit tremendously from digesting a bit. And I know we're not supposed to, we were told not to take pictures. Some people who are not on the CAP were able to take pictures. This is being broadcast. But I mean, really, you can't digest that much data without being able to go back and think about, where do I bike? Where do I go to the supermarket, right?
Well, we didn't say not to take photos today.
Right. Well, I would, but at previous meetings, I wasn't
That was
sure-
about the engineering drawings that weren't finalized that
Gotcha.
meeting.
So we can
Okay,
take-
Tony, you're on. I hear what you're saying. I'm going to ask Rob to answer that question about adding it to the rail subcommittee, Nadia. But I need to have Rob look that up and get back to us. Tony, in the meantime, because I want to keep us on time.
So my question relates to construction, the construction period. Are you going to analyze the same intersections that you propose on the final as-built as the final version? Or are you going to look at additional intersections because traffic will move different?
The answer is yes and no, but everything would be dependent on what staging, what type of staging and traffic detour plans we come up with. Based on the detour and the staging plans, the roadways and the intersections that's gonna be impacted, we would evaluate them. So not necessary that all of these intersections would be evaluated. It's going to be more towards construction side, where the detour signs are gonna be.
And when will that analysis happen?
Once we are moving forward with once we have finalized alternatives and once we have started the design. So usually we do the construction impact analysis.
On which alternatives work and don't work based on?
Not on the construction impacts, because construction impacts are temporary impacts.
They might be temporary, but there's a cost to them, and we should evaluate that cost.
I'm going to have Etty clarify because I think there is some opportunity to get some of this information as she explains the construction impacts, which will happen at the November meeting. So do you want to address that, Etty? And then I want to circle back with Nadia's question about the rail subcommittee, and then we're going to close this topic.
Right. Our goal for the November community meeting is to come forward with the alternatives that are still on the table and kind of at a high level walk through a construction sequencing. Right now, I'm grappling with how to get that information in a time frame that people can digest, but that is the intent. And we'll be coming back to the CAP here at the next couple ones that we have before the community meeting to bring that forward. Once we have, and again, as we're looking at construction phasing and staging, aside from a traffic, there could be fatal flaws that you bring up that would, maybe have an alternative that would be taken off the table. And that's part of the analysis that will be ongoing. And then that's what we're in the process of evaluating right now. So, and then once that's done, then when we have that, then the traffic team then can start looking at what that means as far as traffic delays. But that will not happen by the November 28th meeting.
And it also will always happen during environmental process as well. So
Absolutely.
let's not forget that. I'm going to call on this public person and then this other public person, and I'm going to update Nadia's question.
The 7-day period, can it be spread out in different time of the year so you have different weather conditions?
Nope.
So daylight saving and all those will play into also with the weather conditions. So that's one quick question. The other is about the tire analysis. I know for roadway, you want to study how fast it will drive the level of service. But then for residential way, we are more concerned is also with the safety. Will you be able to also, from the tire analysis, you can extrapolate what the safety impact to the neighborhood?
Then it cannot be done from tire analysis, it would be done as a part of the collision analysis. So we would identify if there is any roadway segment within the area what we are studying it, there is a higher accident or collision rate, it would be identified.
Okay, I promise this gentleman, the public, and then we'll take Megan, and then I'm updating us and cutting this topic off.
All right, I just want to get a couple of comments about traffic on Hawthorne and Everett, especially the spillover traffic out of Highway 101 that'll come down Willow, and then they begin to say, how can I get over to Alma? That since the closure of University Avenue has been so profound over the summer, we've seen a tremendous amount of traffic coming through westbound on Everett and Hawthorne, and as soon as they feel they've got an easy cutover to University or further along, or all the way down to a left-hand turn onto Alma, they're trying to do that. As you know, the left-hand turns onto Alma are very difficult. So I saw just enormous spillover on all the Waverly, Cowper, Webster, Emerson, people desperately just cutting, zigzagging. Be a fish run would be a good example.
Okay, comment noted. Megan, and then I'm going to update us on the rail agenda and move us forward to talk about alternatives, which some of the same information could probably come under that topic. Megan.
Thank you so much. Quickly, there's some planned bicycle and pedestrian improvements along Embarcadero right around the current grade separation. Is the study going to take any of those planned changes into account?
Yes. While we are developing the recommendations, we will take into account what's been planned.
Okay.
We would only take into account the ones which are fully funded projects.
So that would include Charleston corridor?
That's correct. Any project that is fully funded, that would be taken into account in the future year analysis.
Okay, so I checked with Rob, Nadia's request that perhaps that if we could get this soft copy out to the CAP members ASAP, you all would do your work and close business next Monday, you would get your comments back. The next rail committee agenda is coincidentally that Wednesday morning at 8 o'clock, so Rob has agreed that this topic could come up again at that item. And Etty, do you see any issues with any of that?
So I just want to make sure that we're striving here to get a traffic study done by the November 28th community meeting. And so all these, as we do all these studies, so we have up there Palo Alto Churchill, and I'll have Nayan and Ruta talk to this, but we may only be able to do Palo Alto and Churchill, and maybe not the combined one, but what we're trying to do is get because again, after you've made all these dots, then they need to go out and do the traffic counts, which could take, 3 to 4 weeks. Then they do the analysis. So we're up against a tight window. So just keep that in mind, that we're trying to get these studies, and we do want your input. But we just need to keep that in mind. So the reality may be we only are looking at the closures for Palo Alto and Churchill, and maybe not the combined at this point in time. So,
but we'll do our best to do all three.
Yeah.
Okay.
Eileen,
I'm
in-
moving
in-
us on to the alternatives. Nadia?
I was just going to say, in addition to the map, the presentation that Nyan gave would be helpful, and definitions of what those things are, because we've now got to take what we barely got half an hour with, spit it out to
You
our
got more than
residents in
half an hour,
something
but
that's,
okay.
well, on this topic, we started at 4:30 on item number 4, so I'm counting, right? And we've got to sort of try to
And it's
regurgitate
5:10.
it and explain what everything is, right? And then try to get you feedback that is not just, let's put a dot on every street that we have, right?
So we do have our tradition of posting this PowerPoint, which there's no reason why that can't go up right away. Yes.
Yeah, so first of all, this is not the only circulation study we'll be doing. We're doing a lot of studies on circulation because it's a really important topic. And I like to suggest, first of all, this has been really helpful for the team. You have another week to think it through a little further, share it with your neighbors, let us know by Monday, and we'll talk about it again on Wednesday at the rail committee meeting.
Correct.
But again, this is a circulation study on 2 crossings. We'll be doing a lot more circulation studies in the future.
Right.
Okay.
Can I just add one more thing?
Sure.
While they're thinking. So when you go back home and think about the closures, please don't look at each and every intersection. Think about the major intersection, because once you get all the counts at the major intersection, that goes throughout your corridor. So having each and every intersection on the corridor is not going to give you a different result. So please keep the number of intersections low, but think from the perspective that where is the traffic coming, which is my major intersection. Just don't go and mark every intersection on Othro, every intersection on Everett, because that's not going to help. Yeah.
Okay, Etty, you're on for the alternatives.
I'm going to be very brief and quick here. This is just the matrix that has been at the community meeting and the council meeting. And we are, right now, we talked about the traffic studies for the Palo Alto closure and the Churchill closure, which I just want to point out really don't involve any engineering from our point of view. It's really the analysis on traffic. The ones highlighted in yellow are what we're continuing to develop the engineering on. And we'll talk a little bit about the citywide tunnel here in a little bit. The Palo Alto hybrid we're continuing to work on that one. That does require some design exceptions from Caltrain, so we're going to start that conversation with them to see their appetite, thank you, for the design exceptions on that one. At the last rail committee meeting, the trench, what we used to call reverse hybrid, in last CAP meeting you said stop that word, but this is an old this is an old one. Their recommendation was to combine that. So really we have 3 alternatives at Charleston Meadow. We have the hybrid, the viaduct, and the trench. And then the citywide tunnel, which we're continuing to have that conversation. So I'm going to invite John Mayer up here he's going to roll out another thing, and we're going to all sit and take a quick look. And so some of as he's rolling out the map here that we want to talk about, some of the constraints that we're looking at for the tunnel is we are going to keep the tunnel in the existing alignment.
Let's flip it the other way so they can see it.
Oh. So we are going to keep the tunnel in the existing alignment so that the train is still on a straight alignment. The existing stations are going to be assumed to remain operational. I want to point out Palo Alto is the number 2 most used station within the Caltrain system. So it has a lot of passengers that are using that for commute. And then the tunnel, excuse me, I gotta get water. Are within the city limits. And
You're right, you talk, I'll get that.
John's gonna talk now.
John Mayer, AECOM. I'll go over kind of briefly the design concepts for a bored tunnel. You can see in this typical section that it's 2 bores that are running parallel, and then every 1,000 feet or so there's an interconnection passageway for emergency. In case there's a fire in one, you can go to the other. Okay, for a bored tunnel, you have to have a certain separation, obviously, because the tunnels themselves, are singular, so the minimum distance between them is 15 feet. So you also have to get down into the ground far enough where you can start the boring. And you have to get down, basically you need 10 feet to the ground from the top of the bore. And that ends up being 38 feet. So you have to have a trench, goes down 38 feet before you can then bring in these boring machines to start boring.
So I just want to point out, this is a picture.
Oh, watch out.
Sorry. This is a picture of a twin bore, and so that those twin bores are 40 feet down in a trench before this, and then the boring machine is starting to.
Caltrain is a 2 double-decker currently, so you're gonna have a high enough.
Yes.
Point of clarification is,
They're 34 feet in diameter.
John, this is all the specifications because it will also have freight in a tunnel. And it would be different if there was freight at the surface, correct?
It would be slightly different.
Well, the fire life safety rules would be different, the clearance levels would be different, right?
It would be clearance, and you're right, with freight, there's gonna be more ventilation because of the exhaust and so forth. But, those are definitely complications with the freight.
And can you accommodate double stack containers?
It will accommodate what Caltrain currently has in their criteria for freight, and they want 20. They want it's PUC 24 feet clearance basically.
So nobody's consulted Union Pacific about double stack containers?
We're not dealing with the railroad. We're dealing with would be Caltrain, and so we're just going by their published criteria in this plan.
Somebody should.
Yeah.
Question here on.
They can't do.
Okay,
double
Tony's
stack.
got the floor.
They can't do double stack to San Francisco anyway at this point because the existing tunnels going into San Francisco don't take double stack. So they're already limited in that.
They're much smaller. Tony?
I have a question about why the clearance that you quoted when the London Crosstown Tunnel was built 5 feet from a historical building with soft foundations that was 400 years old.
Right. At this planning level and this concept, it's to be fairly conservative. You don't want to thin it down. It depends on all of the factors, the geotechnical and that. So basically, this is what our recommendation is from our tunnel people, to start with. They want to see normally a tunnel diameter cover. So the 10 feet is pretty small compared to that.
Yeah, but if you can do it in 5 feet, why do we need 15 here?
Well,
if you're at 5 feet,
I mean, you've got to have cross utilities. You're going to have. I mean, it's going to be a lot of impacts, at that shallow of a distance. And I don't know if they did tunnel boring machine at 5 feet.
Did.
I mean, that just sounds impossible to me, actually.
I'll show you I'll send you the video.
But anyway,
All right, we'll try and focus us back in on what you want from this group right now because we're on a time clock and I want to make sure we have time to talk about financial stuff.
You have in your mind, you have these 2 34-foot diameter tunnels, and when they get down to a certain depth, then you can start these tunnel boring machines, okay? So at that face, what you call a portal, is 100 feet wide, okay? Because you have the 2 34-foot wide, you have the 15, and you have 10 feet either side, and it ends up being 100 feet wide. So you've got a 40-foot deep, 100-foot wide pit to start these things. Then you have to have a chute fly that runs around it. So consequently, if you're starting at San Antonio and you come down, the actual portal itself, the southern portal there, would be just south of Charleston. And at that location, the chute fly would take all of Alma Street. So you would have to close Alma Street for about 2,000 feet for a year, for the duration of the construction. So these things take, Eti showed up there, they take a phenomenal amount of space to actually get them constructed. It's not just a matter of them starting at ground with a little machine like that. You've got to have all of the space. So that is the main complication associated with, you're going to be taking, and on the northern end, you're going to be taking, what we're figuring is probably you have to be taking homes to be able to get enough space. So.
So Etty and John, what are you trying to get the community group here to react to
I think
and
it's
give
just,
feedback on?
I think the feedback is, the construction impacts, the elimination of certain major roads, and then also, of course, someone mentioned the cost, and that is a huge factor,
So you're saying houses will be taken if we go for this option during the construction period?
There is no room at the northern end near
Northern end
Palo
here.
Alto Ave. There, the right-of-way narrows down. The right-of-way narrows down, and we need 160 feet width to make this all work. You just don't have 160 feet without going into a few homes.
Wouldn't you have to redo the stations at?
Well, what happened with the stations is the stations can be mined. So once you're down, once you're below ground, then you can actually mine the stations, and the platform would be in between. So you're the only surface penetration would be vertical from the ground down to the platform and whatever is needed there.
Well, but this also assumes that your station is going to be a 15-foot width, your vertical circulation. So so the stations are now going to be, 40 feet below grade?
They'll be 40 feet below grade, but they'll be widened out to greater than 15 feet.
So you need vertical station, you need elevators, escalators.
So there's only one station in that category, right? It's California Street Station? That's the only one.
You've got University also.
I thought the tunnel didn't start until after the
No.
University Station.
Well, it would be that one station, and then, the day station for Stanford games, Embarcadero.
Oh, okay.
If
we build an underground station for that. Wow,
So
okay.
this scenario also does not grade separate Palo Alto, because it's within the city limits, so we don't start, right, at the northern end.
This is not a citywide tunnel. I really think we should stop calling it a citywide tunnel. This is a part of the city tunnel.
If you're trying to keep the tunnel within the city limits, you can't really start it until University.
And I don't think everyone outside this room understands that.
Has there been any discussion of not keeping it within the city limits? Where is the discussion with starting it in a northern city?
Menlo Park or Atherton.
But back to house takings, right? Is it going to be around the portal? I heard you say it's going to be around the portal.
That isn't finally designed. I'm just saying the potential is there because you need 160-foot width.
Sure, understood.
You know what I mean?
At the portal, though.
At the portal.
So
But also leading into the portal, you can see from these, this is a half-size drawing, but,
So the portal starts at Churchill, so this is
right.
Churchill.
This highlighted area is the huge trench. There's a portal. So it's not as though this 160 feet wide is just for a matter of a couple hundred feet. It's for, 800 feet because the tracks, these trains are going 110 miles an hour and the curves are very mild. And so it's, and the track spacing at the portal is 49 feet. So it takes a while for the tracks to get out to be 49 feet apart. And that whole way is excavated.
And Alma will be closed during construction of a year, approximately, right? From here to here. So from Churchill to...
No, not the whole way.
Oh, no.
Just around the highlighted areas.
Oh, I see.
So I'd like to make 2 points. One is that the right-of-way down by San Antonio Avenue is 150 feet wide, so there's more space in South Palo Alto than there is in the north. And second is, at the University Avenue station area, you wouldn't necessarily have to encroach on the Alma side. There's a huge park and playing field. I understand that we have the underwater storage containers for the city's water supply, but there is more space in that park area that could be used. But
Right, we're saying that we can't start down at Palo Alto Ave, because to do that, you're not into the portal area. You would wipe out University Ave to get down.
But
we're starting after University.
at a high level, this is great and helpful, but for those of us who've been doing this for a while, we already knew this answer from high-speed rail. It's why the community has asked repeatedly that the tunnel be studied with freight at the surface and only having electrified trains inside the tunnels, because it changes all of the restrictions. It allows for much more flexibility in terms of the grade. It has changes to the height clearances, and it has difference for fire life safety and frankly the cost. And we have 3 trains a day that go through that are freight trains. And so we're over engineering for
Honestly, the change wouldn't be that drastic between freight and the electric.
Well, if you could give us a basic cost differential of what the difference would be with freight and without freight, I think that would actually be one of the, so rather than have more specific drawings about what it looks like, I think just giving us the cost differential of freight on the surface and freight in those tunnels gives us a big piece of the conversation to be able to have regionally, because it's part of our, Caltrain has 42 other grade separations to do. So that would be my suggestion to the city, is that we look at that.
But my question would be, what would be the benefit of that when you still have grade crossings at every street, and you have to maintain and operate all those grade crossings and everything? That's expensive.
I don't disagree. I think the point is that freight adds, the freight restrictions have some significant costs. Outside of this conversation, Union Pacific is looking at having a short line operator operate the freight on the line, which would have different requirements. If they don't require 24 feet of clearance, then we could use the actual clearance levels, which is San Francisco's numbers, which are 18 feet. The difference between digging 24 feet down and 18 feet down means that later when we talk about the trenches, you don't change a single road at Meadow or at Charleston or at Alma, and that drops our costs super significantly. So I think, it's not a comment necessarily aimed at you guys. You're just doing what you have to do with the requirements that you have. But it's a much deeper conversation that we're having, where we're using the requirements, assuming that it's going to be Union Pacific. There's a possibility it's not Union Pacific, it's a different freight operator, and we have different requirements. And that, there's no point in spending $300,000 per intersection to study prices for a freight operator that may not be here.
Yeah, we have to look at Caltrain too. They're bi-level cars, and they're higher.
Bi-level cars are 18 feet. The tunnels in San Francisco are 18 and a half feet.
Still has to be 5 feet above the car.
They're 18 and a half feet at the lowest point in the San Francisco tunnels, where freight and Caltrain will both be operating, because those tunnels are not being changed and they're actually getting notched out.
Actually, the tunnels are being changed.
But they're being notched. They're not being greater. They're not going to be greater than 18 feet.
But they are changing them to get that vertical clearance that's needed when you go to overhead catenary.
But it's not 24 and a half feet, right?
Can I just second that exploration? I think there's valuable cost savings in that version.
So Nadia, what you're saying is keep the freight at grade, have the Caltrain go under, and you don't need to dig as much, right?
Your fire life safety. So fire life safety is the amount of tunnels and ventilation and the things they need if there's an accident with a freight train. All that gets very different with an electric train. And also, yes, the clearances would be different. And so, it's not their AECOM is working with the assumptions that they're given and the parameters that they're given. This is part of the larger conversation that we've been having, we advocates have been having with the city about, could we ask a different question? What if freight stays at the surface? What flexibility does that give us? How does it change the cost of grade separations? We're trying to afford the very best that we can. And I get that we don't really want to keep any tracks at the surface. We'd rather all have a park. But if the difference between us being able to put it underground or being elevated, it becomes that we leave the freight train at the surface, it's a big conversation.
Yeah, I'd like to add to what Nadia's saying. If we don't need freight, the grade constraints are relaxed, because electric passenger trains can climb much steeper grades than diesel freight, so that more than 2% if necessary. You can always overpower electric for short periods of time, so that you could have shorter trench lengths than 800 feet, considerably shorter. Second, the grade crossing issue is hardly an issue because freight runs only at night. So all daytime, the gates will stay up. And you would not need to reconstruct any of the intersections. You just have to build.
And it's only 3 trains. And it's only 3 trains a day. Just 3 trains a day.
Or whatever it is, it's always restricted to like 11 o'clock or sometime like that. These are overnight trains.
And outside of the tunnel conversation, all of the retaining walls, all of the elevated structures, a viaduct, a berm, the measurements for how long and how fat and how much weight they have to carry is based on the freight restrictions, right? So again, if Union Pacific is going to give their stuff to a short line operator and we're operating different freight, our restrictions have changed, and that has a tremendous cost benefit, not just for Palo Alto, but for all 42 grade separations. And remember, if we separate in Palo Alto and the other cities don't have their separations, we are not getting the Caltrain benefits, which was the whole point of this thing. So we're not just thinking about us, we have to think about everybody else and what these things mean.
Phil, can I just intervene? So we understand the question. So we'll take a look at that. It's pretty challenging because we don't have an answer on freight. It is an unknown question, but we have to.
I would like to.
We don't know that we have to deal with freight into the future. There could be a change in how freight is handled in the future. We don't know right now, so we're on the assumption that freight continues, and so we have to deal with that. What the specific question is, if freight was on the surface and passenger trains were underground, how would that change the costs?
Yeah,
So
I
we'll
would-
take a look at that and get back to you.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that changing the operator won't necessarily change the requirement for double-stack containers. It all depends on the current and expected traffic, origination and type of traffic. It just means it's a different corporate entity, which probably will be really subcontracting, if you will, to Union Pacific.
Okay, any other things before we move on? Yes.
I got a question. What is the schedule for taking off the tunnel project as a possibility?
That's a rough question.
Well, so we are looking to get a number of alternatives to study, 6 hopefully. The plan was by the end of the calendar year. We think that's unrealistic at this point, but within the first quarter of the new calendar year. And then by the end of the first quarter of the calendar year, to have one solution for the 4 grade crossings, which could be any one of the 6 that are studied.
So by first quarter 2019. Okay, anything else we wanted to add on this topic before we start talking about money? Yes, ma'am.
Are we not going to discuss the trench? Because it looks like it has different engineering considerations.
Betty, did you
Doesn't
have
take-
anything you needed to add that was beyond what
Doesn't
was
have to be-
presented at the community meeting?
Well, I think somebody touched on it here earlier today, that the trench has some serious fatal flaws in the fact that we have the creek crossings, and the trench itself, if we trench like this is shown here, we take all of Alma. So from start to finish. So because we have to run the shoe fly from the end, correct, all the way to the beginning, and then it also involves a reconstruction of the. Let's come back to the trench and have a little bit more, because we wanted to kind of touch on the tunnel today, and then come back and touch on the trench. We have compressed time in here too.
Right, it's just been mentioned many times,
Yeah.
it's never discussed. So.
Yeah.
Is this going to be posted somewhere, because you really haven't said very much about the South Palo Alto
These-
section, and I'm interested in learning about
These will not be posted because these are preliminary engineering drawings until we actually vet them and have them done, checked. Yes, Millette?
But aren't those the ones that are from the meeting anyway, from last
These ones, are these ones? Yeah, so this one is already posted.
August 23rd
This one
meeting
is
is on the
posted.
website.
Could you then comment, please, on the other end of the corridor?
What was your question?
Just south, I haven't really heard like what the impacts would be. I heard you say that eminent domain might be necessary in North Palo Alto, but I haven't actually heard any comments at all about South Palo Alto.
That was the, from San Antonio to Charleston, Alma Street would be closed for maybe 1,500 feet length, for the
And you're talking about
duration.
the tunnel, or are you talking about
For
the tunnel?
Because you were referring to the tunnel, right? Right. So that's the impact of the south.
You guys, please, one conversation at a time. This is being taped and you're a loud background noise.
Thank you.
So that is the impact of the south. You've got a huge impact to Alma Street, because you have that 100-foot wide pit, then you have a 40-foot wide shoe fly, temporary track running next to it. Takes everything.
And that's the long and short of it?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Would eminent domain be required in that section in the same way that you expect it would be in North Palo Alto?
Pardon now?
Would eminent domain be required in
No,
South Palo Alto?
no.
One quick question for Rob. What are the criteria to remove options? How do you evaluate the option? What is the criteria to remove?
The city council adopted a set of criteria. They're the criteria that we're applying to the options. Yeah, they're on the website. Yep.
So let me be clear, when we say right-of-way impacts, it does not automatically mean eminent domain. So let's be careful when we use those words, because that's not the one and the same. Thank you.
Okay, I would like to thank John very much. That was very interesting. And bring up Paul to start talking about money. Wrap these up.
Sorry, Paul.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Paul Penninger, and I'm an economist with AECOM. And I understand that there are a lot of questions about funding and financing sources and alternatives. So I'm here to address those preliminarily this afternoon, and also and more importantly, to get your questions and your comments and your concerns so that we can come back at later CAP meetings and community meetings to more fully explore various funding and financing alternatives. So of course, when talking about a transportation project like this that's relatively complicated, you're really talking about multiple types of funding and financing. And by funding, I mean either grants or line items from a public sector budget, from a city budget, for example. And by financing, I mean loans, loan guarantees, and things that require term agreements and sometimes interest. So usually, you're talking about many different types of funding sources and financing sources that you need to put together in the form of a stack of money. We sometimes call it a capital stack to fund a complicated project. Now, of course, we haven't costed out yet, I think, fully what kinds of projects you're contemplating. So we don't have a dollar nut yet to get to in terms of what we're trying to finance or fund. But you do know a lot about what existing types of sources are available out in the world that you can consider as you're looking at preliminary alternatives. So we've looked at many dozens of different financing and funding sources for you, and this slide summarizes some of the most important of them. They all have horrible and hideous acronyms, which I'm going to try not to repeat, but economists, like engineers and other professions, really love our acronyms. So if I say an acronym that doesn't make any sense, please raise your hand, and I will self-castigate myself. So the first kind of major funding source that you should know about is the Transportation Finance and Innovation Act program, otherwise known as the TIFIA program, which provides direct loans, loan guarantees, and standby lines of credit for transportation projects, including the type of project that you're contemplating here. A couple of things to know about that. It can provide up to 33% of the financing for a given transportation project, and it requires a 25% local match, and that local match can include regional or state sources. So this is a very important source of potential financial support for your project. At the regional level, I'm going to skip down here because we are limited on time. The source that probably most of you are aware of is Measure B, which I gather is held up due to some litigation right now, but in the future could provide up to $300 million, perhaps more, in funding for grade separation projects in Sunnyvale, Mountain View, and Palo Alto. So a total of $700 million available across all of those jurisdictions. And then we're going to get into a little bit more depth on a couple of local sources, which I think are particularly interesting, especially if you go towards higher cost alternatives that go into the billions of dollars, are going to require value capture mechanisms like community financing districts, and or other taxation methods that take advantage of the increase in property values or business values that can be attributed to a given project and capture a portion of that for future public funding. Okay, so I'll talk about that a little bit more. We also looked at potentially increasing property taxes. So there's some room, even in our very constrained Proposition 13 tax world in California, there is some room for Palo Alto to increase property taxes, and you could use that as a stream of revenue to support financing or funding for this purpose. So community facilities districts. We've already talked a little bit about the undergrounding in San Francisco, and one of the financing methods that's been used at the Transbase Transit Center was called a Melrose Community Facilities District. And in that case, what happened is that 2/3 of the property owners around the Transbase Center agreed to tax themselves and to generate revenues through this taxation into a special district, which in turn used those revenues to issue bonds, municipal bonds, which funded infrastructure related to the Transbase Center. So it's a way of creating a long-term stream of revenue that you can bond against to create capital for your project. It requires a 2/3 vote of property owners. So it's something that is not, you can't just impose on a given jurisdiction. It actually has to be done with the consent of the entities, in this case property owners, that are being taxed. But it has the potential for generating a long-term stream of revenue that you can use, importantly, that you can bond against to generate upfront capital. And then finally, property taxes. So we looked at the average assessed value of a home in Palo Alto, not the average Zillow value or Trulia value or any other value that you might get from Google, which, as you can imagine, economists just love. That that all of these valuation sources are out in the world. But I think that the latest Zillow average market value, or median rather, which is a better measure of central tendency in this case, that the median residential home value is $2.7 million in Palo Alto. That's what Zillow was saying. The average assessed value, that's the amount that the property taxes are assessed on, is about $700,000. So looking at that, and given the additional amount that you could increase property taxes, the range based on that is anywhere from $350 to $1,750 per home based on that average valuation. And you could break that down in a bunch of different ways. So federal, state, regional, local sources, there's the potential to use value capture as a method to capture some of the increased property value that you can attribute to these improvements. And you also have the ability as a community to self-tax through parcel taxes or through an increase in your property taxes to fund improvements. Questions? And what I'm trying to get out of this, because just to make clear at the beginning, is I want to hear from you, the members of the committee, and then the public, what I should be exploring more, what we as a team should be exploring more in terms of funding and financing options, and any concerns you have.
Okay, we'll start with Phil. We'll just go around. How about that? Go ahead, Phil.
Okay, so by law, Prop 13, variable law, is Palo Alto forbidden from taxing itself to higher amounts than the $1,750 you show?
My understanding is yes. Yeah. There's what Proposition 13 is. I mean, it's both complicated and relatively simple, and it just means that under state law, the amount that an individual homeowner can be taxed, the increase in the amount that they can be taxed is capped from year to year, right? So, yes, there is a slight interval there that you can go up to.
Okay, Tony, then Nadia.
Question on the total amount. Could you give us some indication of what those numbers look like? The total.
Do you mean what the cost of the projects is?
No.
No, how much you can raise.
Revenue.
I haven't done that calculation. I mean, I think if there were 20,000, residential units in Palo Alto, it would be $350 million a year, something like that. Yeah.
I mean,
but we will need to do that kind of analysis in more depth as we get into future stages.
So that's a perfect thing. You gave him advice just now by asking a question he can't answer, so he needs to go back and get an answer for that. Nadia.
So there's a lot of interest in a business employee headcount tax or a business license tax. I know some people who've done some analysis on this. And if we had rates similar, so San Francisco has a $1,200 per employee headcount tax. Oakland has a $3,000 per employee headcount tax. San Jose has a $100 per employee headcount tax. Palo Alto currently has about $1.63. So clearly we're short some money, and I would highly recommend, and I'm happy to send you offline a paper that was done by a student that looks at how much money could be raised by this, but it could potentially be very significant. And I think from a community perspective, I would say that grade separations are very important to Palo Alto, but they are co-equally important to Stanford and other neighboring businesses, particularly to Stanford's development and future construction. They cannot expand if they cannot get their people out of their cars. And so the interest in the business community and their possibility of also adding to this is important, because we as residents are already paying the $350 million that's being raised out of Santa Clara's Measure B comes already on the backs of the residents.
Well, anybody who pays us taxes, that's a sales tax. That's not a property tax.
But it's already impacting the people who live in the city, right? All the residents are some of the.
But also people who come in here and buy lunch or tennis shoes are paying it too. So,
yes, my point is, but the residents are putting up some money. Is what I'm saying, no money.
Absolutely.
Right?
Amanda, do you have a question or do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, just so I'm clear on what you're asking. Are you talking about a gross receipts tax or just a business license tax?
Either one of those should be looked at. But a per employee headcount, I think we have have 140,000 workers in the city, right?
Right.
So what, and if other cities, if San Francisco is $580, per worker, and Oakland is $3,000 per worker, and San Jose is $100 per worker, there's kind of a good range, right, that you could look at.
Great. Okay, Amanda. And
So
then we're
my
just going down. You don't need to raise hands. I'm going to call on everybody.
Yeah, my question was on the same lines, except that if you go to the previous slide, if there was a business tax, where would that fit in? Would that be local?
Mm-hmm.
Then I
Yeah.
think we should add a fourth line saying business tax, and then we can figure out how to get that.
Okay. Greg?
Hey, I am a little wary of the old "don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that man behind the tree." The previous slide, I think, out of context, the one with the map would, I think, really scare a lot of people because it seems to be indicating to me that we're going to ask the people who live near the tracks to pay for an improvement that will make their quality of life worse. So we need to kind of put this into context a little bit. I also wonder how Stanford would vote, saying that they own a big orange box there. So I don't know how other. I guess I don't understand this concept. Is the idea that something that would benefit the neighborhood, like a bike crossing or a park, would be paid for by local people? Because I don't see how this would make any sense.
Okay, good feedback. Megan?
Yeah, I'd like to learn more about some of the options that were mentioned on the previous slide about bonds and other options that do involve interest. Sort of what could our total liability be? What are the terms of those loans? The length of them? Sort of what are we putting on people that will be living, in the city 100 years? Are we still going to be paying this off?
Great. Yeah, Carrie?
I'm interested in the property tax one is both the CFD and the other one, we would all have to vote for 2/3. And so if it says, the assessment value, which is adorable, if you have a house that's like 2.8, am I looking, I already have 30K a year in property tax. Am I now looking closer to 40? You are. I mean, for a train I don't want. I mean, would it be a citywide vote if we were doing the city residents? And the CFD would also be a local vote of just
Yeah, the people who would be assessed.
The citywide, the property taxes would have to be voted on by all of the voters of Palo Alto. And the way that a community facilities district works is that within the given geography, 2/3 of the property owners would have to vote for it. So, and that includes residential property owners and business property owners. Yeah.
Okay, so more information and maybe some better, I'm seeing maybe some more realistic current values and how that would play out, so it could really make it clear for people, not just the 700, but a 2.7 or a 5.1 or whatever.
To Greg's
The
point,
seven- I
I'm
mean-
looking at going under the hill on this, and you're getting the viaduct, and then we're paying for it?
Right.
The issue with the issue with the valuation, though, is it is important to not base an estimate of future property taxes on what Zillow says is the median home sale price in Palo Alto. It's the assessed value that matters for property taxes under Proposition 13.
Right.
Right.
Because your assessed value will increase only up to a certain capped amount per year.
But I think the point that Carrie's making is if people
Right.
moved in more recently, they are in the $2 to
More
$5
recent-
million
More
range.
recent property owners will pay a lot more.
Right,
And property
and
owners that have,
showing
been-
that.
that have held their homes for a very long time will pay a lot less.
And maybe showing that range, I
And
think
that's
was
a
the advice.
structural issue having to do with Proposition 13.
Okay.
I mean, I totally get it. It's
Yeah.
the two-block thing that blows your mind.
Yeah. Chris?
Oh, yeah.
This is a regional issue. There are 42 different grade separation potentials on the track, on the whole thing. Is there a way to look at this in a bigger context so it's not just Palo Alto doing the creation and maintenance of the grade separation forever, amen?
Well, that's my favorite question that's been asked today. Do you know that, and I'll be very brief because I know we're limited on time, that the ideal solution would be some sort of sub-regional or regional approach to funding and financing all of this, and to have something that is cross-jurisdictional and is collaborative across all of the jurisdictions and all of the businesses and the taxing and the tax entities that are affected. This is an economic development and a mobility and a quality of life issue for the whole region and not just Palo Alto. So I think that's exactly what should happen. Now, can I make it happen? No.
But what you can do for these folks is paint a pretty picture that they could go out and get excited about, and then hopefully bring in all their neighbors. So that's a good assignment.
If you want to
I'm gonna
talk
keep
about a way
us
to
moving.
leverage money, that's the way to go.
And you?
Well, I mean, we've got anchors in the cities. I mean, you've got the new expansion of Google down in San Jose, and you've got the hub up in San Francisco. So, I mean, that's going to be the key to success, it seems to me.
Okay, we're going to move on because you've had your
Okay,
turn.
I have
We've
a-
still got several people to go.
So why isn't the Caltrain paying anything?
I don't know what
Why wouldn't
Caltrain has
Caltrain
said.
pay anything? They don't have a dedicated funding source, and they don't see this as an issue. This is a local traffic circulation
Actually,
issue,
to be-
more so.
Isn't it more precise to say, so Caltrain is owned by the three counties. The three
Right.
counties voluntarily pay money, so we're already paying for Caltrain. So to say, why isn't Caltrain paying for it, really just means, why aren't we, Santa Clara, ponying up more money to pay Caltrain to pay ourselves? If I could just ask, when you do your suggestions moving forward, I turned in something to Eileen and Rob, which we talked about potentially passing out to the group, which is the history of how grade separations have been funded, particularly in Palo Alto, but historically, which points to what you're saying, which is that a regional approach has been used. And actually, the region got together and lobbied the state, and they created a state grade separation fund that they used along the corridor to actually fund the most important grade separations. And given that there's 42 grade separations, I don't see why that isn't something that we are also communicating.
Is that the Highway Railroad Crossing Safety account?
No, this is older. It's from the 30s.
Oh, I see.
Okay, Rob, are you going to send that out? Yeah, he'll send that out. Okay, Pat.
Yes, I agree that a regional response is really important because it affects all of us in the peninsula. And I have a question about the public-private partnership. As Nadia was mentioning, there are a lot of different entities that do business here. Stanford, of course, is the largest, one of the larger ones. We have Amazon, a number of different groups. Is it possible to have a blended funding source where you incorporate not just businesses, but also individuals, philanthropic types of individuals?
Yes.
Okay, good. And
Yeah, so a couple of things. So many of these questions have actually been answered in quite a lot of detail in a financing white paper that the city published, and Josh Mello would quote often. And it's backed by, in my last conversation with Eric Filsett, who's, I think, the chair of the finance committee. He vouches for that white paper. So a lot of these questions have already been answered there. So I don't know if you
And
have a
he's
chance-
aware of that, and also it's on our website.
Okay.
Yeah, but we wanted to make sure that you all, because some of you aren't as familiar as some of you other ones are, that we got, what is sort of the flavor that the public is thinking about, or questions that you've heard? I see Penny's hand up, but I'm still working with this group, and then I'll get to the public.
Don't worry, we didn't redo it. We read it.
Yeah.
I can cite it line by line,
Okay.
and we just updated it a bit.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect.
Okay, all right, I see Penny's hand up, and I think there was two more. Okay, Penny, you're on.
Penny, I'm sorry, can you use the mic so we can get you on too? Sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, just hit the button. It has to be red. There you go.
Got it, thank you. So my question is both a question and a comment, which is this. I mean, I fully concur with what I heard Nadia say earlier, and I really think that we need to do something regional. And I hear staff saying, well, I can't do that. And what we need is leadership on this. It'll come from the citizens, it needs to come from our city council, but it also needs to come from our staff. Because staff-to-staff outreach across, agency lines is going to be very important. And an optimism that we can do this has to be the way we all approach it. Because we're all together going to have to work in partnership and be leaders together on this. So that is really a comment, is how do we do that? I know this is a difficult time for staff. We've had a lot of losses. I'd like to hear from staff about how do we organize a thing like that? How can we,
Okay, let's
as a
get you an
community,
answer. Rob?
support that effort?
Rob is the staff.
Thank you, Eileen, for asking me that question. No, you should know that the city managers and mayors across the peninsula are communicating all the time, and this is not a new topic. And there's a local policy group that meets regularly with Caltrain on this issue. and they're talking about funding and all the different grade separation alternatives that each city is looking at. And the discussion of how can we collaborate together to maximize the funding options, whether it's federal or state, is happening between cities. Do we have a coordinated and consolidated plan exactly? No, we definitely don't. So there's more leadership, to your point, that needs to happen there. But I don't want you to go away thinking that every city is just head down thinking about their own city only. That's not the case. There is a lot of communication. Having said that, there isn't a full coordinated plan for the peninsula for grade separation of the 42 grade steps, which you would think, you would hope there would be, but the reality is there isn't. And each city, some cities are well ahead of other cities on this, which is a big challenge. There's lots of challenges related in the question, but the cities are definitely communicating. If we could communicate more and coordinate more, is absolutely right. We need to do that.
So the other part of my question, though, is how can we as citizens help our staff and our city council bring people together around this across,
So Penny's question for the tape is, how does the citizen get involved, and how do they bring people together, and who do they talk to? Rob?
Well, the main thing to do is talk to your elected officials right here in Palo Alto and the current mayor and vice mayor. I think that would be the first.
They're both conflicted on this issue.
Okay, that's a good point. Thank you, Nadia. She makes a really good point. So,
the rail subcommittee chair?
The elected officials, I should say, of the city of Palo Alto. That would be your first step. But there's also there's policy committees across the peninsula on Caltrain. They meet regularly, monthly. You could find out about those and start commenting at those meetings as well. And then I can tell you that staff is aware of this and understands that a coordinated effort is much better for the citizens across the peninsula.
Okay, I'm going to move this on, Penny, and have you take that offline with Rob, because there's still two more people, and I want to be respectful and get everyone out of here at 6 o'clock. Yes, sir.
Thank you. So a couple of things. One is when communicating out to the public the impacts of these various funding options. I think a couple of things. One, you should indicate the magnitude of the borrowing compared to all prior city borrowing in the past. I mean, I've looked at the numbers. This is, if you're talking about the trenching of the tunnel, it's astronomical cost compared to anything we've done before. Orders of magnitude more than what we've done before. And then to indicate what is the impact on the city's future ability to borrow, should they need to borrow in the future, sea level rise, flooding, how do you address that if you've capped out your ability to borrow? And then indicate to the public, I think someone mentioned this, but I'm not sure, but the impact of those assessed taxes by property values. So not just the average, because if you're, like you said, if it's expensive house, then it's a much bigger impact on you. And then finally, I just want to say that, also two more things. So if you're talking about a private public partnership, if you're talking about paying it through development fees, then what is the magnitude of development that would be needed to raise that much money, given the city's lack of appetite for commercial development? And I think one of the council members had estimated that if it was purely funded by commercial development, it would be the equivalent of 7 Salesforce towers. So that is clearly way beyond the scope of Palo Alto's appetite. And then finally, in terms of, someone said, I don't think a local tax on the local people along the lines makes sense, but actually, I think if the city opts for a trench or a tunnel, the reason they would be choosing that would be to appease the concerns of the residents along the tracks. So given that a viaduct appears to be orders of magnitude less expensive than the tunnel or the trench and equally effective in achieving grade separation, then the only reason to do a tunnel or a trench is because people don't want the raised structure along their backyards. So if that segment of the population understandably doesn't want a huge structure behind their house, I totally get that, but it also makes sense that if you're going to be causing a cost that's so much larger than anything before, the people that are getting that benefit, it makes sense to have them pay more for that. Thank you.
Thank you. And then the other gentleman plaid shirt.
I was one of the lucky individuals that sat through all the first round of community meetings, table by table by table. And I came away with a couple of observations. The disparity in people who have been here a long time versus people who have just bought in, however you want to define that time gap, is profound. It's been aggravated by the new federal limitations on what you can deduct. So I think that's created a dynamic that no one has thought through. In fact, I don't think California has dealt with their income taxes that now apply to us. My bottom line for that is, one, it's going to cost a lot more money than any of the estimates come up with. I don't know how you possibly can fund any of this unless it's a we, us, and ours type of presentation and how that's going to be put together. Otherwise, you're going to have all the divisiveness from what's equitable taxation. I personally think special state legislation should be created, period. To do this is an extraordinary expense for a very common good. If the business community is not at the table in a magnificent fashion, I don't see that even coming forward yet. I see a lot of waffling, and the business community, no place exemplifies the need to come forward positively because we have so many workers per resident. So if anything, Palo Alto ought to be modeling that equation on where money can come from. And then you worry about the tax parity and equity from it later. But the only way to do this is tax a whole lot of people, period. Okay. Otherwise, individuals, it becomes very dear and expensive.
Thank you very much. All right, we're now closed. Yes.
When can we expect an updated white paper on finance?
Here's what we're going to get to, the topics for the next agenda. You've given us a lot to think about. Paul will see what he can produce for our next meeting, which is October 10th here. It's a Wednesday again. David will be back. And thank you all for being here. Let me go through the action items and also a brief agenda for next time. So the action items are, we're going to make sure everyone has the Caltrain Regional Benefits fact sheet that Nadia brought up under the Caltrain electrification item. That was beyond what Rob passed out. We're going to be very clear about what decisions and who made them, et cetera, on Churchill, per the feedback in the community conversations. We're also going to get Mander the 20 questions that he got to Rob, and some answers, and get those back ASAP. We're going to take longer time in the stations at the community meetings if we do stations again, because it didn't seem like there was enough, and that some of the CAP members may be tagged to actually help staff those tables to spread the ability to get information out. The city will have the boards here, but also there's looking into a system where there would be a set for CAP members that one of you all might keep track of, and that you could pass them around over the weekends when the offices aren't open here in Palo Alto. We will, action item, we're giving you a soft copy of Nyan's map. We're asking that you get those comments back by close of business next Monday, and that it will be agendized, the traffic scope will be agendized for the Wednesday morning rail subcommittee meeting. We are also respectful of Nadia's question about maybe there could be some definitions. Maybe not. Maybe Nyan and Huta can work on some definitions that can go out with that map. And also, we'll post the PowerPoint from today ASAP. There's no reason why that probably can't get up tomorrow, Rob, or Millette. I guess we can do that. Millette's giving me the yes, that can happen. And we're going to have looking into a headcount tax, a lot of other feedback that we got under this last item. And we're going to have Rob send out the history document that Nadia already sent over. And we're going to looking at ranges, et cetera, et cetera. Does somebody else have a comment?
Headcount tax and
the employee tax?
Yes.
Yeah. I've got all of it in this. Yeah. We've got it all in detail, but I am trying to be brief. And then then finally, the agenda for the next CAP meeting is a work plan. Rob and I are working on something that will break out what you could see when on the next meetings, more information on the alternatives, information about land use context that both Tony and Nadia had brought up, more feedback on traffic, more feedback on finance, and we'll begin the preparation for our November community meeting. And hopefully, we would also have perhaps the flyer that we could show you that we would send out citywide to promote this effort and the community meetings in November and January. So for the good of the order, I'm going to stand us adjourned, and we will get you a copy of meeting summary. Etty, did you have something else?
So the history of grade separation was published by the JRP, another consultant. Do we have permission to publish that?
It's a state study.
Oh, it's a state study? Oh, so it's public domain.
I think so.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. And Penny, I think Rob's got a council meeting, so maybe you guys can talk about that tomorrow, but I'll leave that up to the two of you.
Cedric.